Emmelyn Wang, and I'm originally from Austin, but I've been living in the Dallas-Fort Worth area for about 5 years. My amazing colleague, Tanya Roberts, is here from Austin from a software company called Stoplight.io, and Axway is my company, and we are partners, and I'll explain why we're partners. And if you'd like to know more, let us know. Also, I'll be asking questions throughout the presentation, and if you ask one, Tanya has given me t-shirts for people who ask questions. Also, there are shirts, there's a ton of larges, some mediums, and very few smalls. So feel free to take those home. They're very comfortable. To me, this is so exciting to share API design with you. I was just in 8 different countries since last October, and I'm finally home, and so I'm really tired and I'm really happy to be here. But if you'd like to know about developer relations in another talk, let Claire or Johanna know, so I can explain a little why I was on the road. So I'll start. So I want to thank Alchemy, Women Who Code, Stoplight, and I'll thank you again at the end for everything. So let me get a gauge of this room, because this can be a little intimidating for me. So who here is really experienced in designing APIs? Awesome. Okay, the reason I'm asking is, so Stoplight, they have a design tool, and their customers are always looking for people with expertise in API design. So maybe you can connect with these 2 people, Tanya. And also you can be my partners to speak up as I'm going through the presentation. I'll explain why. So everyone's API design experience is going to be a little different depending on which part of the organization where you worked, right? And so I'll explain kind of where mine is from. And it takes truly a community to design a highly usable API. So if both of you will speak up and share your experience with the room, I think that would be really helpful to the audience. All right, so this is for someone who might not know what an API is. So this is my Twitter profile, and if I'm in a Chrome browser, and I go to Developer Tools, and when I go to Network, if you'll notice when I'm clicking on the Twitter application, there are API calls being made. So this particular API is RESTful, and I'll explain what that is. So it's using the HTTP protocol, which most of you are familiar with because you type that in the web address bar. And so that's one type of API, web APIs. And this is interesting because, oh, look, Tanya, there you are. So I'm basically trying to change my profile picture so that I can see what happens when API calls are being made to Twitter. You can see some information, not all. Obviously, it would be insecure if you could see everything. So do you notice these status codes? So 200 generally means, okay, great, the call was successful. However, if you design it in a way where you use 200 and something's broken, you're going to get a very angry developer, right? So we'll talk about this. Meaning, so you see these status codes, it's green, so that seems like it could be a good thing, right? Well, just to let you know, so I've documented APIs from scratch where there was no user story. No one had tested it, there was no technical specification, and I had to document the API by reverse engineering it through discovering the payloads in an internet browser. Super painful. This is not the right way for someone to, so I had to explain to another developer how to use the API by what I was seeing in the payload. So don't worry, I was using a QA environment, it was behind a firewall, I was hitting the application that way. But this is kind of interesting, right? Because anyone can relate to what's in the browser. Okay, next. So this API thing is kind of annoying because it's also in your mobile devices. It's on those little squares on your phone. Every single app, every mobile app has to be built using APIs. And so if your company says, I'm sorry, we only do internal APIs. And you ask them, do you have a mobile app? Do you have a website? Do you have an application, say they're a software company? If they do, then yes, they actually have a public API. So this is an interesting sort of scenario. On the left, it's an iPad simulator. On the right, it's using Alexa skills. And what we're doing is we're asking Alexa, hey, how much money did I spend let me know, and then I spent too much, and so this is kind of silly. It's a made-up scenario, but they say, oh, great, would you like a loan, right? You spent too much. Anyway, it's just an example. And so on the right side, not only can you see Lambda, you can see the voice activation. I tried to make this demo foolproof. That's why it's running locally. But it's showing what's happening on the left to where end to end, it tells you, okay, here are your loan options, and you can pick one, and you can also populate it to where you can apply for the loan. So that'll pop up in a few seconds here. And so what's great is the business cares more about the left side. They want to know what impact does the business have. But the developer, the architect, many of you, maybe product managers, you care more about the right side, right? Is it secure, or as Claire said, is it performing? Or, are the details, right? The versioning. And so this is basically, okay, an application for a short-term loan, and everything was done using voice, using Alexa. And so I tried to record it just so it wouldn't fail when I did this. So API design is essentially a blueprint. So you would never build a house with no blueprint. Think of the API as your plumbing. So plumbing is possibly not sexy, right? But you need it. And it has to work. If you don't, the ceiling is going to bulge because water's everywhere. And so APIs are really important to design in the beginning, because what happens is if you add in thoughtful consideration later, now you're dealing with data breaches like the one that Marriott had that wasn't detected for 4 years. So this is kind of my thoughts about API design. So APIs are both machine and human readable, right? The reason why it has to be thoughtful design is because you need to think about the life cycle behind your API. So a developer or a business is going to be very hesitant. So pretend you're a small business owner and you're relying on this API for functionality and data. You want to make sure it's around and that it works, right? And so that life cycle is going to be important, and the credibility behind who's providing the API. And so I will get into details, but I'm kind of starting from the top down. API style guide. So how many of you work for a huge enterprise here? 2,000 people or more? Okay, perfect. So you have hundreds of developers, right? Maybe thousands of APIs. And so I'm curious, how many of you have an API design guide that your company follows? Wow, okay, 2.25, very low confidence level. 2.25, okay, this is great. So I'll share my presentation because I have a global treasure box of API design guides from every industry, and most of them are RESTful, but it's because it's the most mature. Most companies just do this. They take their database and they say, oh, an API is an interface. We'll just expose the database. And then what happens is they'll expose the API and have no idea why certain endpoints are showing, right? And so Stoplight is actually a great tool where you can compare different versions, and you can actually collaborate with each other by looking at the design together. And it also has Spectral, which is automatic linting. And let me know if I should use less of those words or explain any words. Like don't feel like you can't ask any questions. Feel free to stop me. So how many people know about Jeff Bezos's API mandate from Amazon? Okay, so basically he said, I think it was 2012? No, I'm wrong, 2009? Okay, anyway, he basically said everyone in the company, every department must expose their functionality and or data as an API, otherwise you will be fired, have a nice day. It was a company-wide public letter, and he had this foresight to understand the unified interface that would make Amazon what it is today. We don't have that mandate anymore, but basically as a business, if you don't recognize APIs, then that's why I have these stickers, API or die, right? They'll be irrelevant. I mean, maybe not die, but just maybe like not a soft delete, if you will. So this is Ken Lane. So he's famous for being the API evangelist, and he has resources. He just got back on the scene. And I'll share all of these slides. And he says, API design is consistent design. It's each service leveraging existing patterns. I don't think I copy edited, I just took it from his, but he's got a massive treasure trove of resources there. So it's language agnostic, meaning you can consume the API with almost any programming language. And so that leads me to show you some other things. Okay, so goals of API design. So this is my professional opinion. So on the left side, it's growing your business, stakeholder alignment. So many of you talked about how you don't have a style guide. How do you get alignment? How do you make sure your API looks the same and behaves the same, right? So feel free to take this presentation to work with you. You might get a raise or promotion, just saying. Grow your API beyond a project. So what happens is, so some of the area enterprises, they're just now moving from waterfall to agile. And they're just now learning what REST is. And so they just have these little projects. But it's easier to get funding if your API is a product, right? So that's one key piece there if you are in management here or you're looking to be in management. Consistency and usability. So how many of you have gone to developer.company.com and you couldn't figure out how to get an API key to make an API call? Okay, so several people. So don't you feel frustrated? Don't you feel like you gave them one shot and you're done? Okay. So on the right side, it's the technical piece. So the API is literally the contract of you as the provider and who is going to consume your API. It's, you know, I'm having a relationship with you and I promise I'm going to provide these services. And the reason why I love the fact that an API is a contract is the fact that there's accountability there, right? So as engineers, as developers, as product managers, your reputation is literally on the line if you're using an API, and it could be an internal API. And then also, you just want to make everyone's everyone's lives easier, and I'll explain that. Okay, this is supposed to hurt your brain. Does it hurt your brain? Yeah. Okay, awesome. This is a snapshot of the API landscape. Tanya and I are very humbled. You know, we're like sprinkled on here, meaning this topic of API design is huge, right? So pretend that analogy I gave you of a house. Pretend this is home builders, okay? You have sheetrock people and you have foundation people. Same thing with the API, right? And so as you can see, Stoplight, they've got API design and documentation and testing. One that's very familiar for testing and the one that I cut my teeth on is Postman. When I first started using APIs. And then of course, so Axway, we create API management products. And so, but you can see here, you know, if you're looking to understand the landscape. So I'm just gonna zoom in on that smaller part. So meaning there's a lot of people in this space, there's a lot of companies in this space, but can you imagine your boss tells you, hey, you know, we want to choose a backend service. You know, it would take too long for you to research, right? But this might help if you're not doing anything with API design yet. Okay, so at the very core, and this is what everyone misses, the core of your discovery for your API has to be your specification. And then you build everything around that. And the problem today is, okay, so I went to NASA's API, it's an open API, and I couldn't find the Swagger. It was really hard for me to find the Swagger. So that's the question you always need to ask yourself. When you're looking for an API, immediately say, where's the spec? I want the spec, because immediately you can then pull it into your IDE and start consuming the API. APIs are not the toughest piece, it's really the culture. And I can talk about that another time. But yeah, however, you know, I did like this portal, so I'll also say some nice things about the NASA API. So you can contribute to it if you want to. And it's kind of nice, right, from a usability standpoint. We have a lot of usability experts in the room. It kind of gives you a little bit of a path, but it's kind of oversimplified, right? It's like, oh, get key and then API. I mean, it's not really that simple, right? Catalogs. So catalogs are all about discovering your API. And I'll talk about two different ways of discovery. Okay, so this is the part where I get to show you something. So if you don't take away anything, remember Sandbox. So the only way to really understand the API besides the documentation is to try it. So I don't know if you're a hands-on learner, I love trying things. And so when you click test drive our API, It gives you a sandbox, and the best part about this is it gives very clear expectations. It says this is a non-production service. After you register, it's setting expectations. It's saying you get only a few. There's no expiration for your sandbox access. You're only limited to 5,000 calls per week, request and response. And to me, this is awesome because you're saying, hey, it's a sandbox, come play in here, but remember, this is not going to be like your production instance. And so what's important is, from a, I guess, monetization standpoint, people play in your sandbox. That's a good way to give them a path to then have maybe like a paid trial and then finally to pay for your API. So Dun & Bradstreet is the most lucrative API I have ever worked on in my entire career. So does anyone know what a DUNS number is? So it's the social security number, if you will. It's a unique identifier for every company in the entire world. So if you can imagine, so their API, each customer pays millions of dollars to access their API. So that's kind of interesting. Okay, I don't know how to make it go back, but I will try. Do I need to, oh, hold on. Maybe?
I think you just need to bring up your screen before, because it just minimized it, right?
What do you need? No, I was just trying to go back to the PowerPoint.
Yeah.
Let's see.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Okay, so best practices. So if you use an API design guide and you design an API the way that developers expect to experience it, and I'll go into the details of what that means, then they'll learn your API easier, they'll use it more often, they'll create apps, websites, applications, and build amazing things. However, most organizations cannot get it together to design an API that is that seamless. So Stripe and Twilio are probably the most famous examples of APIs where organizationally, they got it together, right? There's a ton of self-service, even non-API experiences. So anyone here use MongoDB? So how many of you love the onboarding experience? So, okay, just a usability standpoint. So when you use M0, the database, it's self-service. So just not the database itself, just that experience, right? When you sign up, you can kind of, you know exactly what to do. So developer experience is basically, so earlier I showed you NASA. So what you want to do is take your own developer portal, or if you don't have one, to create one. Friction logging means that you have someone, without using it before, try it, and you record, or they also record what roadblocks that they hit. And that's how you can make your developer experience more smooth. I learned about developer experience from Pamela Fox. So she's this amazing developer who was, I guess, one of the earliest developers to bring that phrase up. Common pitfalls. Okay, so hand coding a specification is really painful. Don't do it. Human error. Some companies just produce the Swagger, which is now basically SmartBear donated Swagger. Now it's called the OpenAPI specification. And that OAS, OpenAPI specification, just because you generate it, that doesn't mean you're done. Also, the spec is not enough. And so earlier we talked about how easy is it to find your spec. Okay, so here's another one. What is the state of API design today? And again, the really experienced ones, please speak up, because this is just from my experience. Discovery is key. So what happens is people create APIs throughout the organization and forget, oh wait, we already have one that pulls all addresses for employees. Oh great, now we have 3 different ones, right? So that's an issue. So the way that you do discovery is you have a way to find it in the beginning. And so in the future, I don't know, can I talk about the feature a little bit? Okay, so Stoplight has a tool that will be able to go to all of your repositories, and it will be able to discover all of the APIs in your repositories before they are out in production. And then at the end, you would have a unified catalog once your API is published to production, and that's how you could discover those APIs. So basically, you need to have discovery along the entire life cycle. API consumers. So I was very lucky to work for a company where we did API design and we actually considered stakeholders' needs. It was awesome. The iOS developers were in this room, and the Android developers were in that room, and then we had internal application developers in this other room, and we had Scrum Masters, and we actually talked to each other, and we designed this API, and it's still being used today. So eBay Motors, I don't know, anyone here car enthusiast? Sweet, okay. So today if you go to eBay Motors and you look up this awesome, I don't know, car, say a car, what's a good car? Yeah, okay, Tesla Model S. And you want to get a used one, but it's in Connecticut, right? So you go to eBay Motors, you click on the zip code tab, you put in your zip code, and it populates auto transport folks, and you can decide which one to use. And I'm excited because my company, UShip, we actually worked on that integration, right? And so we were considering all the third-party developers. So we have a developer portal, and I got to feel the pain of using our API because I did API support for third parties wanting to integrate with our API. And so I recommend if any of you here work at a company that has an API and people integrate with it, jump on support. It doesn't matter what role you are, even if you aren't technical, you can then start to understand the patterns of what you're seeing and what's a pain. Sometimes it's just the onboarding. Like, oh, okay, the onboarding, the authentication is really confusing, right? And then finally, agility and security are actually the API design antagonists, meaning speed to market and oh, it's got to be safe. You're basically managing trade-offs there. It's getting really hot, wow.
It is getting warm here. Can I add something to that?
Yes, please do.
So, I think the one thing you brought up earlier about the contract is a really valid point. I think when you're talking about speed and parallel development and getting rid of that butter call, I think that API design contract also speeds up development because they can try out the API while they're still building the mobile app or while they're still in development. So
yeah, that's really good. Yeah, so Johanna and Megan had a hackathon on Saturday at TCU. And so with a lot of the tools I showed on that landscape, you can actually instantly spin up an API and use it to design a mobile app within a few hours. I mean, end to end. And so to me, that's kind of awesome. Okay, so the state of API design is, okay, originally it was SOAP XML, and I'll try to fly through these. It was very verbose and it focused on machine readability. A lot of governments and financial institutions all around the world still use SOAP. There's WSDLs and waddles, and that's all you need to know. So what happened, that's all you need to know. You can look this up when you get home, when you grab a cup of tea, but I'm not going over that. Okay, so, and it sounds funny, right? Okay, so now there's so many clouds, right? We've got AWS, Azure, GCP, and anything that's coming out from the rest of the world. There's so many clouds. And the reason I mention this is request response or RESTful APIs, even though that's the critical mass and OAS is the most mature, that's not going to be the only type of API in the future. And so if you're looking to kind of expand your career, especially with APIs, understanding both REST-based architecture and event-driven architecture is important. I just put up the bare minimum. REST, think HTTP, like what I showed you in the beginning. Event-driven, not HTTP-based, however, it's fire and forget. So with REST, it's request and response. So you saw with my Twitter example where you could see the payloads and the header, request and response, right? It's kind of like a chatty conversation. With event-driven architecture, it's basically there's a broker and you have messages firing out and it's less chatty. And so the reason why that's important is event-driven architecture gives real-time APIs. So the stock market and things that need data that's younger than 15 minutes, you basically need event-driven architecture. But you can't just take, oh, well, I really like this and that and combine it. You can't do that today. You can, but that's another talk. So REST-based architecture It's also not supposed to be rigid, so it's RESTful. So I was going to put a little emoji, the guy with the Z's, but I thought that would be too much. These are the main verbs when it comes to resource modeling. Create, so post, you create a new object. Get, you basically try to get objects from your database. So earlier I said addresses of employees. Put, you update, and then delete. Delete may be a soft delete, meaning it's not, actually gone, it's just maybe gone from the application. High level stuff. So there's a new specification for messaging APIs, or event-driven APIs. And so I'm in this open source community. It's called Async API. We actually need members. I'm the only woman, so would really love it if any of you could join, men and women. We just, I'm carrying a heavy load, so. And so this compares OAS 3 with the Async API specification. And the reason why this is important is Slack uses Async API, right? Slack uses messaging, meaning there are companies today using this messaging API in production, right? And so that's good for you to learn. Also, I want to compare something else. OpenAPI or OAS 2 is very different from OAS 3. Meaning there could be breaking changes. So most companies are mostly on OAS 2 if they've even gotten there, and they're kind of afraid to jump forward to OAS 3. And so again, I'll share all of these slides, but it's important for you to kind of, because you'll get questions, right? And so knowing some high-level differences might be helpful. So this is one of my favorite things. So there's a company from New Zealand, it's called API, and they have a free specification transformer. And I'll explain why that's important. So usually when I'm at hackathon or any day at my desk, I'll get a ping on Microsoft Teams, and a developer's like, hey, I'm creating this, and I have this YAML spec, but I really need, RAML, right? And so what's great about this tool is it's free, and you can convert, so you can input Postman collection, OpenAPI Swagger, those Whizzle Waddle things I was talking about earlier, all different kinds of formats, and then that transformer will output the spec, and it's compliant to the output that you need for whatever you're coding. And so to me that's really important, because when it's in the right spec, then you can pull it in the tool that you need, which then you can generate an SDK and pull it into your environment and use it faster. And so I didn't want to overwhelm you, but that's kind of what a spec looks like. It's Pet Store, but I don't recommend it because everyone gets tired of Pet Store. And I'll share all the links too. Oh, and the other thing I forgot, sorry. So data models. So APIs, the reason why you want collaboration is you want to have modular, reusable aspects. So for example, that employee address I mentioned earlier, maybe you want to reference it on their paycheck stub in ADP. And you also want to reference it on the certificate that they got because their patent was approved, right? So all of the data models, you would create one data model, and then different APIs would be able to reuse that data model. So that's important. And then here's what it looks like if you, again, don't use API design. There's question marks. API shipped? Whereas if you use a tool to use the spec and talk to different groups inside the company, and then mock and test, now, and this is a loop, right? Then you'll be able to get agile, reusable pieces every sprint. That's important. So this is a create, control, consume scenario. Oh, yes.
So, quick question.
Yes.
Because a lot of this is built around culture.
Yes, it is.
And I've worked with a lot of hard-headed developers that like doing things their own way.
Okay.
So how do you work with a team to get everybody on board doing a specification like this?
Ooh, okay, so I want to give the group a chance to answer first, and then I'll answer as well. I just want to make sure everyone gets a chance to.
I guess what I would do is I would first find out, like,
what everybody wants to accomplish, because if everybody feels like they're included and their opinion matters, you're already opening up the doors to creating communication. And then, I don't remember what book I read this from, but one of the things that you can do is ideate first. Don't try and hash it out. Don't try and get actual what the exact points are. Just talk about it, because sometimes people will shut people down without even thinking about the thought, and that was the exact thing that should have been done for that time. So those are the two things I do.
Awesome. How about anyone else? Sorry about that. And feel free to pick a size. That's really good. So there's a methodology called API Ops Cycles, and it's Creative Commons licensed. And the whole idea around it, API Ops Cycles, and I'll show it to you in a second, is it's a way to get business and IT or developers to talk. And so it gives you tools, and I'll show it as well, as to how to collaborate. And that might be a really good session that Johanna or Claire, that we could do. Because I think culture, so there's a really good podcast called the Microservices Culture. And so I recommend that one, and then maybe we could do a session here. So yeah, I basically, API Ops Cycles is using Agile and Lean methodology, but in a way where it affects your culture. And again, it's Creative Commons license, so you can try that. So I hope that helped a little bit. Okay, so I'm gonna go a little, I only have a few more slides left. So I kind of talked through some of these things. Because at the hackathons, you can use either of our tools. But again, the landscape, I showed tons of tools. Okay, so this is actually what I wanted to show you. That's perfect. I'm gonna make you guys dizzy one more time. Okay, so there is this, so you can't see this yet, huh? I have to move it over, give me 1 second. Okay, so, oh no, I can't see it to make it big. Okay, so I'll try, I don't know that I can drive it from here. I'll try my best for you. Okay, so under here, and I won't go to it just because I think it's difficult for me to drive, but you know, when you get back, you'll be able to see that this method, so there's the API canvas, minimum viable API architecture, API audit, developer experience. So those are the methods, and then these are the resources. And the reason I mention that is, so some of it is having a way to approach people. It's a total mental model shift, completely. So there's this phrase called API first, but most companies, they don't think API first. And I always empathize with the small business owner, right? So as a small business owner, ideally I should be API first, but say I'm not technical. However, if they do that, they'll be able to iterate and build faster than a small business owner who doesn't use APIs. So the reason I mentioned that is collecting requirements. So you basically use your company's customer journey, and then you talk about the value proposition, and then again, you can have a project to prove it, but then you have to create an API product and a program behind it. Meaning, and I have visuals for this, you kind of start smaller, like with a prototype to show the value. So I can give an example. So 7-Eleven is trying to compete against Amazon. And so they do not use AWS, right? They only use the other clouds. And that's interesting because they have launched 7Now, which is competing against Prime Now. And they're trying to be the next Amazon. Can you imagine? 7-Eleven right here. And so to me, the reason why that's interesting is most of their employees, it's a very complicated structure, and it's a Japanese company, right? And so the reason I mention that is you've got all these very difficult cultural aspects of trying to bring people together to build APIs. And so it's very tricky, but these resources can help you do it, because then you'll be able to pull the right information together, maybe across departments, to show kind of what you're trying to do. So does that kind of help a little bit? And then,
Emily, can I add to that?
sure, please
I
do.
mean, because I think, to answer your question, one of the things we find at Stoplight is that we're trying to get people, everyone says they want to do design first. If you ask everyone, they're like, oh, yeah, design first, going to do design
The
first.
developers just like to build.
But developers are going to do the way they want to do it, which is exactly, so we just rewrote our product to basically give you the ability to connect to all of your repos. And so all the collaboration and all the workflows are going to go through the processes they're already used to using.
Okay.
Everyone's already used to using their GitHub or their GitLab or their Bitbucket, so we're not going to change anyone else's process. So, great. Coded by hand, code it here, code it there, we don't care, but we can still suck it in, give everyone the idea and the advantage of collaboration, give everyone the advantage of reuse of the designs, and be able to document automatically. And so, because it's really hard to change what a developer does. Because as much as they think that they can do it without errors by hand, it's a myth. It's going to take twice as long. And eventually that person's boss is going to notice how much longer it takes them to come to market with that design. So, anyway, we see it a lot.
No, well, okay, so I'm sorry.
Yeah.
If when you connect to a repo, what does that mean? Do you have to have a type language to get all the information you want, or can
So basically, we can connect to all the repos and bring anything that's an API design, an API, an endpoint, an article, and bring that in, analyze it, and give you a way to explore across it. And I can, anyone who wants a preview of that, just let me know, and I can invite the group to see that.
Thanks so much for asking. So I was going to walk through, so this is where I'm jumping into, so I went through kind of the overview, I showed you the API ocean, right? So now we're kind of back to more concrete, what's specific. And this could probably be a session by itself. So each section here, it's easier for you to understand it if you see an example, right? So I'll probably ask Claire if I can do a webinar where I show an example, because it's hard to understand, okay, each API must have a descriptive title. That doesn't seem, what does that mean, right? And so it's better to see specific examples of these. And then same thing with naming standards. So it does tell you to use ISO standards, but keep in mind, so this is for most RESTful APIs, but your organization might have a different way of implementing and consuming and serving APIs, right? And so that's why it's important for you, what a lot of people kind of try to do is they look at the different design guides, they look at how their API is acting currently, and then you have to make decisions. So as architects, you have to manage trade-offs of exactly how you want your API to be today versus tomorrow. Localization is one of my favorites. Especially in the US, it is very difficult to do time zones with an API. So if any of you have ever worked on an e-commerce API, Arizona, I think, is it some parts they do and don't have a time change because the farmers, anyway. So privacy and security, what you pass in the URL. So earlier you saw Twitter and you saw how in the browser you can inspect payloads and resources. So you have to be careful what you're passing in and out, because I don't like the word leaky APIs, but if you don't design for security, that's what happens. Same thing with your authorization, when tokens expire, etc. Versioning is also incredibly important. So you could have a whole day just talking about versioning. How do you structure it? Do you put it in the URL or not? I mean, there are many different ways to do it. Breaking changes. So this one's important. So did anyone use the very popular social media platform Google+? So the Google+ API, the free one, died. However, they did a great job of letting you know, okay, do you want to save your data? Here's when it's going to RIP. We've created a tombstone for it, right? So those are good practices that everyone should be doing with their APIs, but people don't. What happens is people go, oh, no one's using this plug, right? API gone. Oh, great, my app was in the App Store and now it doesn't work anymore. This goes, again, deeper, and we could do a whole other session just on namespaces, resources, and HTTP methods. I'm just kind of showing you a design guide. Endpoints, and then you go into the actual verbs and what they could do. And so what's interesting is the crud verbs that I showed you earlier, there's others. So there's patch, there's several. I think head, is that correct? And then error handling, I mentioned at the very beginning, which now I want to go through, is the fact that you have to be very careful with your error messaging because if, as a designer like Johanna, certain error messages, do you ever open your favorite social media app? I don't want to promote any one of them. And it's got strange curly brackets and 3 numbers. Okay. Basically, that error got exposed in a way that wasn't graceful, right? And so these error messages are important because it helps your designers to return the right information in a way that's more graceful. And then filtering and pagination is especially important. So with request and response APIs, basically how do you want to format your API so that it returns the proper number of responses and the type of responses that you want. Hypermedia links is a controversial topic, so I won't talk about it here, but the gist of it is that so RESTful API design means that there's not a state, but when you use hypermedia links, it's supposed to suggest where you can go next. And I can show you an example if you want to see it after. Sorting is another one. So you sort by sort order. How do you want to sort, right? Alphabetically, etc. And then you've got single resources. So this is a very generic, RESTful design guide. However, here is one from our friends down under. So Atlassian, let me get this back up here. Okay, so we went through this one. Oh, okay, so I'll show you the Atlassian one in a second because I have to move it back up here. So there's many tools, and so this talk is less about tools, it's more about your approach. But if you want more about basics, there's the API design guide that was just published. And then there's an article by, I think it's David Wood, about API security design. Again, those are talks in itself. And so the style guide and Stoplight, basically what they do is they take your style guide, and if it's an OAS spec, they can actually lint and check your API to see if it's compliant. And if it's not, they'll tell you exactly what isn't compliant, and you can set what you want it to check. So that's kind of a cool scenario. Okay, there's a French gentleman. His handle on Twitter is the API handyman. Arnaud Laudet. I don't think I'm saying it right because I don't speak French, even though I work for a French company. He collected API style guides from around the world, including Adidas, Google, and so you can find it there. You can even suggest some. I would love it if any of you would submit your companies. No pressure, yes, it is public, but the reason why this is amazing is other people, you can learn from each other and sharpen each other. There's 15 different guides and different industries, which I think is excellent. Arnaud Laudet himself, he's a financial, I guess, European finance expert. So if you want to know about the open banking standards or GDPR, those kind of things, he's a good person to talk to. I already talked about discovery on the front end, so that was Stoplight, and on the back end, you use a unified catalog. And then discovery, I'm talking about trend detection. So for example, say your API, you have, okay, so Starbucks. So their first mobile app, they had so many API calls that their app kept crashing, right? So they had to understand why it was crashing. And so trend detection, usually using some kind of analytics tool that's either with your API management or a separate one, can help you say, oh, it's every 11th call. So say you're on an e-commerce page and they try to check out in the shopping cart, but it keeps failing because of something. Well, when you look at the analytics, you can discover API calls if they're up or down, and whether or not you need to fix something in your API. Audience insights, that's very common for SEO, SEM, and then deeper research, of course. So for example, Google Analytics Enterprise. Okay, so this one is another ocean. This is also another talk in and of itself. I'll just show you two things so that your brain won't hurt. So my friends, a group of people wrote this book, O'Reilly, Continuous API Management, and they talk about the human and the automated blend of governance. So governance just means standards. It just means, hey, we need to build this in a way where everyone understands what it is, because I don't want to look at the API 3 months from now and say, I'm not really quite sure why I exposed it in the .NET code that way. And you look in the code comments and it gives you nothing, right? So that's one. And then the other one is API Economy 101, Changes Your Business. And so both of those books are a good blend of technical and business pieces, because business, that's how you get the money to build APIs, right? This is a map. This is amazing because, so you manage your API, but you need to have the proper amount of lifecycle, design, business value, developer engagement, ecosystems, authentication with all the different types of authentication, speed to API. I love this because when you're doing governance, you can actually try to go through these types of, we call them like mind maps, and make sure you've addressed them. And if you're a product owner, maybe you can only address a few that you prioritize. Streaming APIs. So, Axway is one of the reasons why I'm here. We just released an API that takes your existing REST API and request response and makes it a real-time API. So you can try that if you want to as well on your own. And then documentation. So a lot of people have asked me about that. So I wrote some documentation, and this is what I wrote. And the reason why this is important is it's documentation about the documentation, which is kind of meta, right? So I was basically explaining to the developers, right, here is an API, and oh, I know your time is very valuable. Oh, you want snippets? Hey, we have all these languages. And oh, this is the authentication that you use, right? And so again, I'll share these, and they're public as well. This is more documentation about the documentation. So say they weren't familiar with the interface. So say, has anyone here used Stoplight for documentation? And so this kind of documentation basically might be useful in the beginning when you're getting started, or this might be in the form of a video where you show someone instead of telling, like I did here. Something that's very difficult for managers to understand, API documentation is a full-time effort. So a lot of, and that's controversial too, so a lot of companies think, oh, well, my developer can just document the API. I mean, like they could just, after they design and build the API and test it, I mean, they can just document it too, right? I mean, there's 40 hours in a week. API documentation, it's very, it's very meticulous. You have to have the right environment, you have to be part of the CI/CD process. I'm seeing this trend where a lot of software developers are now, as the next step in their career, becoming API documentation engineers because it's such a huge effort. And so I want to show you the guide from Down Under, like I promised, and then I'll open it up for any questions. So you saw the generic one from API Ops Cycles. So here's from Arnett, the API Handyman, Arnaud Laudet. This is one of the ones he collected. So Atlassian has REST API guidelines. This is one of the versions. And on the left side, you can see, I don't know if this is big enough. Should I make it bigger? So these are all the things that you need to consider, right? Updates and versioning, governance, what is in a collection, and then I'll get to the piece that I'm trying to dive into. Pagination, which we talked about earlier, what data format it's in, so how you perform your search. So there's something called OData. I'm just going to put that right there, OData. Okay, and then that that's one of the ways that you could do search in API. But that's, again, I don't want to go into it too much. The piece that I love here, so caching is important for performance. For performance, Claire. And, and then this is the part that I wanted to show you. So these statuses, so the 300s, so you can see, so you'll notice on all my social media, I have 302. That's my bio. Anyone here knows what 302 is? So it means found. It means, hey, you found me. So my bio is just 302, right? I mean, that makes sense, right? That's the status code. You found me. 201 is a created. 200 okay is my favorite. 202 accepted is, it's all right. Unauthorized is difficult, but I want to know why. 404 not found, so I love the fact that GitHub and many websites, they have fun with the not found page, right? You have the 3D Star Wars OctoKitty or something. I've never seen a precondition failed. If anyone has, I'd love to hear about it. More about hypermedia. 500s are typically, it's a server error, right? So that's when you need to go talk to someone in DevOps or IT. So I know that was kind of detailed. Let's see. So does anyone have any questions?
I had a question about versioning.
Sure.
Really just like, what is your, because like with software development, you can bug fixes, minor point release, major point release. A lot of times what I see with APIs is just V1, V2, and V3. So like when do you think is like the best time to like upgrade your version, or like what would you do about a hotfix where you just slightly change what the name of the variable is? Like what's your kind of thoughts on that?
Sure. So I look at it from the product management viewpoint where you would decide what structure of versioning you would want. So for example, you were saying version 1, version 2, but for example in Async API, that specific spec, for smaller, minor versions, we have 1.1, and then it always comes out with some release notes. And to me, I think it depends on also your business, right? So you might have a critical patch or fix that's for a paying customer, but that affects everyone. So I feel like it's the scenario, but I would probably adhere to one of the style guides. So basically, you have to create guidance for your organization for how you would do the versioning and try to follow that, right? So there's kind of the trade-offs I mentioned earlier where it's situational and then also marry it with the API version guidelines. And it's pretty tricky to do, but that's kind of what I would advise. Does that sound?
No, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay,
and
awesome.
then one more question.
Yes.
Sorry.
Oh, no, not at all.
You also mentioned designing APIs to be client agnostic, but and then you talked about having your iOS team, Android team, and web team. So like, how do you kind of merge or work with that? Like what would be the things that like an iOS client would need versus an Android client versus in a client agnostic?
Yeah, no, that's really good. So I have specific examples, so I could either show that or publish it or send it to you, because it's very, very specific. And it's kind of I'll give you an example. So you know how different coding languages, Swift versus Java, they might consume an API differently. Well, it's very nuanced, and so like you said, the iOS folks and the Android folks, I don't know, people here are probably better at mobile questions than I am. Is anyone in here a mobile development expert? Because it would take some iOS and Android developers, they would be able to communicate that to you, and then you, like you said, trade-offs. You would have to say, okay, yes, as a product owner, they would have to say, yes, we'll make these changes for iOS in this sprint versus that. And then typically you look at usage. So for example, I mentioned the Starbucks app, right? So maybe more Apple users use Starbucks app. So then they would update that API with the iOS, even though it's client agnostic. I mean, it's tricky, right? It's humans, but it's an API. And so just those trade-offs, and I know that's not specific enough, but it's the same thing as there are now all of these amazing, like, you know, Flutter.io? There are all these amazing, I think Johanna could speak to that, APIs just for designers, for design elements, right? And so I'm not an expert on that, so if anyone is, feel free to help me out. It's very difficult to manage all the different stakeholders' needs and wants, and I think that's why that whole agile cycle view is important, because, okay, what can I achieve in demo in this sprint? And say I can only tend to the Android developers' needs. I hope that kind of makes some sense. Yeah.
The collaboration is so key in our
Mhm.
tools. We're finding that product owners are having all the teams collaborate on the contract because they're starting with that contract, and so everyone's chiming in. And so if they're going to put together the spec, they want to make sure it meets everyone's needs. So it just gives a place to start. So just going off the build the API, they start with that contract and really have everyone collaborate in sort of that measure twice, but once. It's the same thing.
Yeah, thanks,
Yeah.
Tanya. And that's a good point. Basically, you can use a spec, but I mentioned earlier Hiram's Law. And so to me, that's something to consider as well, right? So when you're collaborating, a lot of people, they think that the API does a certain thing.
Right.
But people don't actually verify that it does that. And then, you know how I showed the before and the after? Then what happens is the result that you're trying to get, I'll give you an example. An 18-wheeler hit my car. I was trying to file a claim on the Nationwide app, and I couldn't get through the claim process on the app. It should have been an easy thing. The app kept hanging, etc., right? And so the reason I'm mentioning that is the result that you can physically see from the API, to me, that's the answer that you can get quickly to know what you should fix. Because basically salespeople will say, hey, I can't sell X because this doesn't work, or I can't show Y because they don't know that it's the API that's down, but you know that it's down. So I hope that kind of helps as well. So this is tool agnostic recommended materials, but I love your idea. Tanya, I'll create a page that's every link that's in this presentation on my page.
Yeah, one page.
Yeah.
Thank you. So
This
if you
girl's
want,
never lacking on content.
yes, yes, and then this LinkedIn Learning. So that's, I think, is a paid class. So
Yeah.
Keith Casey, he basically talks about RESTful APIs, and it's very useful to understand how they work. Tom Johnson has a ton of resources. The reason why I'm talking so much about documenting the API is if you're trying to use the Amazon API and the documentation's down, literally hundreds of developers and analytics people around the world can't use it. That's how important the doc is. Continuous API Management is the book I mentioned, API Economy 101. I wanted to thank Alchemy, Claire, Women Who Code again. And if you guys have any more questions, let me know. I need to follow up with this lovely lady here. There's tons of cupcakes, t-shirts. Please take them home. So, thank you.